Yo! Well, hello. Where did you come from?
Hello everyone, so this is a video which is a book review of a very important book, and a book I finally got around to reading, and I'm going to talk about its background a little bit. I'm going to talk about what I thought of it, and I'm going to carry on in the series as well. So this is a book that's the start of a series of books, and I was influenced by Michael K. Vaughan to read it because he talks about Edgar Rice Burroughs a lot, and this is A Princess of Mars. So this was Edgar Rice Burroughs' first book. And I didn't know about it. I've known about it for ages, before the Disney film came out. I think that was 2009. And then I did watch the Disney film. Hadn't read the book at that point, but I watched the Disney film. I think I'd already seen a cheaper kind of rendition of the story, which was like a made-for-TV film that appeared on the Sci-Fi Channel. I think Tracy Lords plays the Princess of Mars in that. So, yeah, I saw that ages ago when that first came out, and then I saw the Disney film. So I knew about the characters and the setup from those things, but I hadn't read the book. So clearly I didn't know the source properly. And I've been meaning to read it for ages, and now I've finally got around to do it. Basically, I kind of went on a deliberate search for the books, and I've got 7 of the books, I think. 6 of the books. 6 of the books, I think. Can't remember. Anyway, I've got a bunch of the books, and I'm going to carry on reading them because I really enjoyed it. So I also think it's quite a fascinating book for many reasons. So it was initially written as kind of serialized in magazines. It was in All Story magazine initially in 1912 in serialized form, and then in 1919 this came out, which was a book form of Princess, and it was called A Princess of Mars, whereas the serialized version was called Under the Moons of Mars. So he decided to call it Princess of Mars when it came out as a novel, and altogether the whole series has been nicknamed the Barsoom series, which is Edgar Rice Burroughs' name for Mars. So we call it Mars, but the Martians themselves, call it Barsoom. And the Princess of Mars character in it is a very important character in this, and it's kind of his motivation for, so John Carter's motivation, he's the main character, his motivation for kind of getting more embroiled in the society, and it's like the catalyst for his big plot in the first book. And there's like a romantic thread going through it in this book. So John Carter is the main character. The film, the most recent film, the 2009 film from Disney, was just called John Carter, and John Carter's the main character. He's a Virginian cavalryman, and so he's a soldier, and he mysteriously, inexplicably, is transported in this cave to Mars. It's not explained why, but I don't think that's the point. I don't think that's what this sort of book is. I'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, he goes to Mars. He's transported to Mars. He doesn't know where he is. It's all a bit freaky for him. And clearly he's in this other planet, and everything's really weird. And he has to kind of adjust to that at the beginning. He does adjust to things very quickly, it's got to be said. He learns their language in about 3 weeks. But, you know, he's clearly a heroic character. So Edgar Rice Burroughs wanted to paint a very capable character who would be what he would describe as heroic. I think that's important, actually, that it is a book of its time, and I think heroes were heroes. It was kind of a much more black and white. It wasn't like there was sort of flawed characters as much. It wasn't as celebrated to have a book with flawed characters in it. There would have been flawed characters, but to criticize this book for John Carter being too perfect would probably be kind of ignoring the time that it was written, really, because I think it was quite a standard thing to do that. You know, it's like criticizing Elvis Presley for not writing his songs. You know, it was what was done then. So when I say it's a product of its time, there are some elements of it that I think you can tell it's written when it was. So, for example, this sort of more sort of perfect hero in John Carter as one element. I don't think the prose is that obviously from the turn of the century, but it's you certainly you'd know it was like pre-1950, but I don't think it's outdated. As in, I think if you read some other things around the same time, they could seem more dated. So I do think that there was a spark and a pace about it that he was clearly trying to write an adventure story that wasn't quite as poetic, if you like. There are little moments where the prose is nice, but it's not really the big point of the book. So you can definitely say, I think that you could tell from reading it, it's definitely pre-1950, but I don't think it's necessarily, obviously, that early. But there is a damsel in distress character. So the Princess of Mars in question, she does have that element to her character, but I also think she's characterized as a forceful and strong female character as well. So while I think some elements of her story is indicative of the time, I don't think it's quite as extreme as just like a foil for John Carter's actions in it, and just sort of this objectified damsel. I don't think that's what's going on here. So I do think that's really interesting that the secondary character, if you like, in it is a very strong female character. So yeah, it was written in that time, and what's really interesting is you also have this sort of romantic idea of war, I think, from this book, because the plot basically involves John Carter inexplicably turning up on Mars and then getting involved in a turf war, motivated by his curiosity and attraction to the Princess of Mars. But he realizes that this is happening and basically takes a side and becomes an important leader. So I'm not to give you too many spoilers, but the point is it does have a militaristic element to it, and I think that's a product of this time. So at the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, there were all sorts of ideas that were being popularized, and standard thinking, just the way they were with science. There was the empire, ideas of empire and imperialism are really strong. Ideas about nationalism are really, really strong. So if you like, nationalism is like a modern take on tribalism, and there's a lot of tribalism in this. And there was also ideas of eugenics and breeding better people and all that kind of thing. There was also the idea of identifying a race of someone from the shape of their skull and stuff like that. And there's all sorts of science that has clearly been disproved since then, that were fueling people's ideas about nationalism and ultimately racism. So those kind of ideas are in the ether when he's writing this. So it's not a surprise that it's got that militaristic aspect to it, and it's not a surprise that there's a tribal element to what he thought might appear on Mars. Also, what they knew about Mars at the time was nowhere near what we know. So now we wouldn't put all of those different creatures and tribes and all those different types of people, Martians, on Mars now, because we know it just doesn't happen. But then they didn't know, and Mars was quite a romantic idea. They had science fiction writers and fantasy writers, people that wanted to use science fiction as a backdrop, because I really am stressing that I don't like people who say, oh well, it's not accurate, so it's fantasy now. It's science fiction. It was written before the term science fiction was coined, but it's clearly set on Mars. It's set in space. So anyway, enough of that. They didn't know what was on Mars, and around this time, and obviously a little further on, until we did know more about Mars. Mars was, because Ray Bradbury did the same thing. Mars was this sort of planet that was near us, that we could imagine all sorts of interesting things that might be happening. So it allowed authors to explore, well, if there is life on other planets, what is life like? And would they be like us? And if they're not like us, would there be some bits of their life that are like us and some bits that aren't? And I do think that's really interesting, and I love that. It's one of the things I like about science fiction, that I find it endlessly fascinating in a really big way. I'm very passionately fascinated by the idea of life on other planets and the fact that we are this sort of small speck in the universe, and we have got these unique properties on our planet that mean that we're the only planet in our solar system that can have life, but the only planet on our solar system that might have life. But you know, there we are. One of our star is one of billions and billions of stars, so you just don't know, and that blows my mind. I love that, and that sense of wonder is in these early pulpy science fiction books where they don't know about science so much and they don't take science so much seriously, and it's a tool to explore their imagination and think, well, what could be out there, you know? And I love that. So he decided to set this on Mars because he thought it was an interesting backdrop for the story, but again, he had to invent what was on Mars. They didn't know. So I do think that's brilliant, and I love the fact that these things exist, and then there's nobody saying, oh well, we need to correct that or whatever because it's not scientifically correct. Well, things are going to be inaccurate, so that's the whole point of science. So anyway, that's a bit of a diversion, but I do like the fact that science can be inaccurate, and in these days when science was and the idea of what was on other planets was a lot more innocent, and they didn't know as much, there was all that sort of stuff that they could fuel into their imagination. So that's what they did, and that's what Edgar Rice Burroughs did for his first novel. So he went on to do Tarzan, and incidentally, Tarzan's popularity was why this ended up being a novel, because it was serialized, and then Tarzan got really popular, and then he brought this out as a novel. So, yeah, he wrote Tarzan as well, which I'm going to get to later. I'm going to carry on reading these as well, and then I'm going to read the Tarzan book soon. So, when I'm talking about the imagination and what this book does, I'm going to talk about how some of these things that he invented for Mars. It was quite cool. So you imagine John Carter gets on this planet, and he encounters these creatures and these different kinds of Martians. So the green Martians are a big part of the plot, and he sees them first, and they got 6 limbs. They're extremely tall, like 15 feet tall, and they got tusks, and obviously they speak a different language, although he does learn the language very quickly, but they speak a different language. So it's very alien. It's very, very alien. And it's a really cool kind of concept. So the green Martians like that. The red Martians look a lot more humanoid, but they've got this sort of red tint to their skin. But it's interesting because I think he's done that because when he does see Deja, who's the princess, he's kind of stunned by her beauty, and presumably that was easier to sell if she looked a bit humanoid. So I think that's true. But I think the description in the book is more extreme. Her features are more extreme than what you see on the film version. So I don't know if they could have CGI'd it so that she was still beautiful but had more extreme features. I don't know, but that's a side comment. That's a CGI thing. But anyway, yeah, the green Martians and the red Martians are the main humanoid creatures you get in this book. There's also Woola, who is a calot. I think it's called a calot, and they're like the pets that they've been domesticated. And he's like a big dog, and he's been given to John Carpenter to guard him, to stop him from escaping essentially at the beginning, and then they become companions, and he kind of gets a lot of affection for her. So Woola gets a lot of affection for John Carter. John Carter has a lot of affection for Woola, and it's essentially the dog character in the story, you know, like R2-D2 is in Star Wars. And I think it's a really kind of sweet element to the book. It's like this massive beast. It's got 10 legs, and its head's kind of like a frog's head. It's quite a good version of it in John Carter film, I thought, actually, the Disney film. So that kind of looks quite accurate. So Woola's quite a nice, sweet character in it. And also, you get the thoats. And the thoats are these really long creatures, and they've got 8 legs, and they've been domesticated, and they're like horses and that kind of thing, but they're called thoats. It's funny the way the brain works, because every time I read throat, I kept seeing throat. Also because it's not capitalised. If it was capitalised, it might be easier for me to not see throat, but I kept seeing throat. It doesn't make any sense. So anyway, the throats were another frequent creature in the book. And anyway, this sort of big sense of alienness was a big part of the book as well. And as he explores the area and gets involved in the politics of the different tribes, that's how the sort of plot develops, and it becomes this big sort of turf war, basically. There's this big climax at the end. So that's kind of the plot, and some of the creatures and some of the alienness and some of those sort of things that he adds to it, because science wasn't developed enough for him to be that accurate, which is a good thing. I think it's good, it's worth celebrating. But I think the ripples that this book has set off is really important. So this is a hugely influential book, and you can see. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about all these different things that spun off it, because this was written so early. I mean, this is, as the 20th century starting, he's writing this, and all these things that his imagination throws onto the story. You can see it in things like, at the end of the book, when I was reading the end of the book, it was reminding me of Krull. I wanted to see the film Krull. I don't know if you've seen that. It's an 80s fantasy film, and essentially a science fiction film as well, really. Because they got lasers and guns in it and all that. But it's got lots of fantasy elements in it, and I do like Krull. If you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. You might not like the effects and stuff, but you might see it's cheesy, but yeah, it's got a similar kind of damsel in distress, war, factions, all that kind of thing going on in that story, actually. But it is different. But yeah, Krull is really cool. So anyway, I was reminded of that. Massive reminder of Star Wars in this. So there's lots of elements that I thought George Lucas would have taken from Star Wars. And on that front, Star Wars has been often looked at as far as his influences, and people have talked about Kurosawa being an influence on George Lucas. But George Lucas has said himself that he wanted to create an adventure series like Flash Gordon. And the interesting thing with Flash Gordon, something I learned from Michael K. Vaughan when we were chatting about this before I read it, he said that they wanted to put Princess of Mars in comics, but they couldn't get the rights to it, so they created Flash Gordon. So Flash Gordon is a direct result of this, and with George Lucas saying you wanted to make something like Flash Gordon, then he's clearly saying he wanted to make something like a Princess of Mars. So I think that's interesting as well, that you can see that influence in Star Wars. But with all the sort of political factions in it and the way the world building works in this, you can see Dune being influenced as well. So something as literary and revered and also influential as Dune, you can see the influences that Princess of Mars has had on that as well. So I do think that's really, really interesting. And actually, another thing that I thought of just before I started doing this video was there's a lot of telepathy in it as well. So they can read each other's minds, and actually he learns to read their minds as well, John Carter. And the telepathic element of it as well is something that came into science fiction later. And you've got books like The Demolished Man, which is a fantastic book, and that's all about telepathy. And the Demolished Man influenced other books as well. So, these ripples are really important. I think it's something else to celebrate in this book. So it's a really fun book. It's got a really fast pace. It's got characterization in it. It's got really interesting world building, and that the alien creatures that he creates are really interesting. So it is a product of its time, but it's not really obviously a product of its time. There's nothing particularly offensive in it or whatever. And it's written well. It's a really nice book for me to discover Edgar Rice Burroughs properly. So he's always been in my my sense of culture because of not only did I know about these things that he influenced, but I did know about those John Carpenter films. But also, when I was younger, I was a huge fan of the Tarzan film Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan. I love that film, and I've always been meaning to read the Tarzan stuff, and I'm going to do that soon. So, I've known about Edgar Rice Burroughs, but this is the first time I've read his book. So, yeah, really nice surprise. Really enjoyed it. Totally influenced by Michael K. Vaughan, because he talks about Edgar Rice Burroughs a lot. So, big shout out to Mike. And it was interesting when we were chatting about that Flash Gordon element, which is really interesting. But yeah, if you're curious, definitely read it. And if you have read it already, and if you read other books in the series, please let me know what you think in the comments. I'm going to carry on reading them. Apparently, I've been told The Gods of Mars is the best one, but we'll figure it out. But yeah, thanks a lot. Bye.